back to my channel. I just want to go through some more of your comments. Just some of them. So one of your comments, which I thought was particularly interesting, so I'm going to sort of like read it out in full, or almost in full. It's to do with sub-threshold autism cases. And you say that maybe they should bring back the old, not otherwise specified categories that were very helpful. Because there will always be people who have significant features of the condition but don't quite meet the criteria. So in the old DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there were some not otherwise specified diagnoses, most notably pervasive development disorder not otherwise specified, and pervasive development disorder not otherwise specified was supposed to be given to people who were, I think it was used to cover actually quite a broad spectrum of people. So some of them might have been somewhere between autism and classic autism and Asperger's, and maybe they had all the features of Asperger's, maybe, but they might have had some speech delay or something or other. I don't know. I can't quite remember. It was kind of a weird diagnosis because some of the people given the PDD-NOS diagnoses were like really, really, really mild, and others had quite severe features, but they maybe were a little bit more autistic than, say, your average person with Asperger's and things like that. And then some of them were like maybe had an atypical presentation where some of the features were not typically seen in autism, maybe, but they were still clinically significant. So it seemed to cover like quite a range of different people. So it's quite a strange diagnosis. I didn't quite understand it. But now, actually, I'm aware that in the latest DSM, which I think is DSM-5, they've actually introduced a new diagnosis called neurodevelopmental condition not otherwise specified, which is completely different to the old PDD-NOS diagnosis. People often get confused. They're like, isn't that the same as a PDD-NOS diagnosis? No, it's actually completely different. The new neurodevelopmental condition not otherwise specified diagnosis is meant to be given for anyone who has clinically significant features but don't meet the full criteria for any particular neurodevelopmental condition. So, for example, they might have quite a lot of autism features, but maybe are sub-threshold for autism. They might also have quite a large number of ADHD features or dyspraxia features, but they don't meet any of the conditions 100%. They can't be diagnosed, say, with any one condition because they don't meet the full criteria for any one developmental condition. And yet, because they have significant features and are clinically impairing, and that these features are developmental in origin, and they might say, for example, they might have a lot of dyspraxia features, they might have a lot of autism features, they might have a lot of ADHD features, or they might just have features from any one of those conditions, but not enough to meet full criteria. So some of them, I'm guessing that some of them might have quite a lot of autism features, for example, but be sub-threshold. So maybe that would be a little bit similar to the old PDD-NOS thing, but then there also might be other people who also have a lot of dyspraxia features, a lot of ADHD features, but again don't meet the full criteria for any of those. So it's for anyone who clearly has a developmental condition, a neurodevelopmental condition, but does not meet the full criteria for any one of them conditions. They will get diagnosed with neurodevelopmental disorder not otherwise specified. It's quite a vague diagnosis, and I'm not quite sure how it will help people, because how are people going to get help or assistance for such a diagnosis? Because people have heard of autism and all those named conditions, but if someone's going to say, oh, I have a neurodevelopmental condition not otherwise specified, they're saying they have a neurodevelopmental condition, like a disability, that affects them developmentally, but it's not like it's not really a very clear diagnosis, is it? So I'm not quite sure where it's going to go. But yeah, so you say that, yeah, there will always be people who have significant features of the condition but don't quite meet the criteria, and that's true because, you know, categories and constructs are rather arbitrary, and there are going to be people who are just beneath the threshold level for those conditions, and yet they're still really, really struggling. They still have a lot of features that are really affecting their life. They still might have atypical brain neurology. It's not like the brain is kind of, you know, the brain and categories don't always completely meet, do they? Someone could have quite significant atypical neurology, if you like, so they're not, in inverted commas, neurotypical, and yet they don't meet the full criteria for any of these conditions. And yet, you know, they still have a neurodevelopmental something going on, it's just it's not quite at threshold. So that's what that diagnosis is supposed to help with, neurodevelopmental condition not otherwise specified. But as you say, you think that such subthreshold diagnoses must still be clinically significantly impairing. Otherwise, what happens is the pathologising of typical variation and diagnostic creep. So yeah, I completely agree with you. If someone's a subthreshold case, they must still be disabled. It must still be affecting them significantly. You know, whatever features of neurodevelopmental conditions they have, even if it's not enough to meet one of the named diagnoses. And maybe these people actually do have a condition of some variety. It's just it hasn't yet been described by psychiatrists or neuroscientists or whoever does the research. It's neuroscientists who tend to do the research, isn't it, into brain and stuff. So, you know, they might fit into some subtype, maybe some kind of mixture of features that is its own subtype or its own condition that psychiatry or neuroscience just isn't sophisticated enough yet to name and diagnose. But yeah, they must be clinically impairing, or otherwise, as you say, you're just pathologising typical variation. So I would say whenever you're doing a diagnosis, whenever a diagnosis is being made, whether it's a named condition or this vague diagnosis, neurodevelopmental condition or otherwise specified, there must be evidence that the person is clinically impaired. And that clinical impairment, because neurodevelopmental conditions are developmental in nature, there must be evidence at some point during a person's life of clinical impairment. So it is true, you know, what I'm trying to say is that presumably you'd only go to a doctor, right, if you're struggling, normally, right? I mean, you'd assume that. Otherwise, why would you go to a doctor? But obviously, again, there are some people who, I don't know, might want validation, or maybe because someone else in their family has been diagnosed and they notice traits in themselves. I would say that's not in itself good enough to get a diagnosis. Like, there has to be evidence that it's clinically impairing you. And yeah, there are all these philosophical questions about, do you have to be impaired at the point of going to the doctor, or say if you had him, and I'll be interested to know your thoughts on this. Say if a person currently doesn't experience themselves as clinically significantly impaired, maybe because they're in maybe because they've learned coping strategies or something, or they're in a really good environment that meets their needs, and yet there was evidence of them being clinically significantly impaired, say in childhood, for example. What would you say? Would you argue that that person could then still go and get diagnosed with any of these conditions, even if at this point in time they're not clinically significantly impaired? That's a question to ponder. I'm not sure about that, because these conditions are developmental, so therefore they need to show evidence of a person being clinically significantly impaired in childhood. So I'm not sure, but I would say that, yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? These conditions are clinically, yeah, I mean, that's a question for philosophy, isn't it, at the end of the day? And there's been a lot of research into whether or not autism can be outgrown, and that's a highly contentious issue. Do people outgrow their diagnoses? Again, the jury is out on that. Is it possible? Because in theory, the brain can actually rewire itself. So maybe a person who is clinically significantly impaired in childhood, maybe as they grow up, their brain can rewire themselves. That's a topic for another video, really. It all comes down to, can we fix autism? Yeah, big topic. Anyway, I'm going off. So, what your in actual fact, I'm going to move over to video number 2 now, because those are just some questions that maybe you need to ponder. Okay, can you outgrow autism? Is it possible for someone to have a clinically significant? Because if you're arguing, as I would argue, that autism and these other conditions should only be diagnosed if the person is clinically significantly impaired, and that has to be across multiple contexts, by the way. So, you know, it has to be across multiple contexts, doesn't it? Even if the impairment isn't necessarily obvious in all contexts, it has to be impairment in all contexts. It can't just be in one context. You know, it's pervasive, isn't it? So even if a person is, say, holding it together, say at work or at school or whatever, there still needs to be evidence that they're impaired in those settings, because it has to be across contexts. But what I'm trying to say is, could a person have evidence of impairment in childhood, but then learn compensatory strategies, and as they get older that impairment becomes a lot less evident, and then as an adult they might still have some difficulties but not to be clinically significantly impaired. So they might go to the doctor because clearly they might still have some residual difficulties, but they're no longer impaired. Could they still get a diagnosis just based upon a developmental history of impairment? That's the question I'm putting to you. Okay, because I think this is an open-ended question. I think there definitely has to be evidence of impairment at least at some point in the person's life, bearing in mind he's beginning childhood, so it has to be shown at least in childhood. It definitely has to be signs of impairment in childhood, definitely. I think that is the benchmark, isn't it? No impairment in childhood, you don't have a developmental condition. I mean, there has to be evidence of impairment in childhood. The question is, can you outgrow that impairment and still be diagnosable? Put comments in the box below. There's no right and wrong here. I just want to know your answers. Anyway, so I'm just going to move over to video number 2 because I just want to carry on covering some of your comments. So just moving over to video number 2 now.